In the swamps of what is now central France, 305 million years ago, something is hunting. It hovers 2 meters above the surface of dark, still water. Wings beating so fast, they blur into translucent sheets catching the filtered sunlight. The creature is an insect, a dragonfly technically, but it has a wingspan of 70 centimeters, nearly 2.5 feet from wingtip to wingtip, larger than most hawks you've ever seen. Its head is mostly eyes, 30,000 individual lenses packed into 2 enormous compound structures that wrap around its skull, giving it nearly 360 degrees of vision. It can see ultraviolet light. It can track movement with a temporal resolution 4 times faster than yours, meaning the world appears to move in slow motion from its perspective. Right now, those eyes are locked onto something at the water's edge, an amphibian, primitive by any standard, more fish than frog really, about the size of a large salamander. It's hauled itself onto a rotting log to bask in a rare patch of direct sun that's broken through the canopy. The creature is unaware. It has no concept of aerial predators because aerial predators as a category barely exist yet. Birds won't evolve for another 100 million years. The dragonfly doesn't think. It doesn't plan. But 300 million years of arthropod evolution have encoded the attack sequence into its neural architecture with perfect efficiency. It adjusts its angle, tilts forward, and strikes. The impact is over in less than a second. Spined legs snap closed around the amphibian's body. Mandibles, serrated and powerful enough to shear through exoskeleton, bite down. The amphibian thrashes once, uselessly. The dragonfly, Meganeura monyi, though no one will name it for another 305 million years, lifts its prey into the air and begins feeding while still in flight, because it can. Because nothing in this world can challenge it, because the sky belongs entirely to insects. This is not your world. This is not a world where humans could survive. The air you'd be breathing contains 35% oxygen, nearly 2/3 more than what you're breathing right now. That might sound beneficial. It's not. At those concentrations, oxygen becomes toxic. Your lungs would suffer inflammation. Your central nervous system would start misfiring. Prolonged exposure would kill you. But for insects, for arthropods with their entirely different respiratory system, this atmosphere is paradise. And it has allowed them to grow to sizes that seem impossible by modern standards. Sizes that are impossible by modern standards. If you're intrigued by this, if you want to explore more deep time mysteries and the strange worlds that existed long before humans, please subscribe. Your support makes this work possible, and there's much more to discover. The discovery of Meganeura began in a coal mine. This detail matters because coal and giant insects are connected in ways that weren't obvious to the 19th century workers who first found the fossils. In the 1880s, coal mining was transforming Europe. The Industrial Revolution demanded fuel, and coal seams dating to the Carboniferous period, 360 to 300 million years ago, were being excavated across England, Wales, Belgium, and France. Commentary in the Allier department of central France had particularly rich coal deposits. The mines there cut through layers of shale, compressed mud and silt from ancient swamps, interspersed with coal seams. Miners would split the shale to access the coal, and occasionally in the surfaces of the freshly split rock, they'd find impressions. Fossilized leaves, mostly. Sometimes the bark patterns of ancient trees. Rarely, something more unusual. In 1885, a worker splitting shale at Commentry noticed a wing. Not a small wing. A wing with a span of over 60 centimeters, preserved in exquisite detail. The venation pattern, the network of supporting veins that gives insect wings their structure and strength, was clearly visible. It was unmistakably a dragonfly wing, but it was impossibly large. The fossil was brought to Charles Brongniart, a French paleontologist and entomologist who had been studying fossil insects for years. Brongniart examined the specimen and immediately recognized its significance. This wasn't just a large dragonfly. This was an organism that challenged basic assumptions about insect body size. He published a description in 1885, naming it Meganeura monyi, large-veined, referring to the prominent venation, and monyi honoring A.M. Money, who had helped with the excavation or donation of the specimen, though records are unclear. The paper caused immediate debate. How could an insect that large have existed? Modern dragonflies, even the largest tropical species, have wingspans of about 15 centimeters. The largest reliably measured modern dragonfly, Megaloprepus cerulatus from Central America, reaches about 19 centimeters. Meganeura was more than 3 times larger in wingspan, which translates to roughly 30 times greater in mass, because volume and mass scale with the cube of linear dimensions. Could it even fly? The physics seemed impossible. Insect flight depends on rapid wing beats generating enough lift to overcome body weight. Larger wings should be heavier, requiring more muscle power. But insect muscles are constrained by how they receive oxygen. Insects don't have lungs or circulatory systems in the way vertebrates do. They breathe through a network of tubes called tracheae that deliver air directly to tissues. This system works brilliantly at small sizes, but seems to have hard upper limits. Yet, here was a fossil proving that somehow, at some point in Earth's history, those limits had been different. Brongniart couldn't explain it. He could only document it. The fossil was real. The measurements were accurate. Meganeura had existed. Over the following decades, more fossils turned up. In 1895, a nearly complete specimen was found, also at Commentry, preserving both wings, parts of the body, and even some leg structures. In the early 1900s, similar fossils appeared in coal deposits in England, in the Midlands near Derbyshire. In the 1920s and 30s, expeditions to Carboniferous rocks in Kansas and Illinois in the United States found related species, not Meganeura itself, but close relatives in the same family, Meganeuridae. Some were even larger. Meganeuropsis permiana, from the early Permian of Kansas, had an estimated wingspan of 75 centimeters, 2.5 feet. But finding the fossils was only the beginning. Understanding why they could exist required understanding the Carboniferous atmosphere. and that understanding didn't develop until the late 20th century. The key breakthrough came from geochemistry. By the 1970s and 80s, scientists had developed techniques to reconstruct ancient atmospheric composition from chemical signatures locked in rocks. One method involves analyzing the ratio of carbon isotopes in organic material and carbonates. Another examines charcoal abundance. Fossilized charcoal, called fusane, forms when plant material undergoes incomplete combustion. And the amount of fusan in rocks of a given age tells you something about fire frequency, which correlates with oxygen concentration. A third method looks at the carbon-to-sulfur ratio in sediments. When organic material is buried in oxygen-poor conditions, like at the bottom of a swamp, it can be preserved rather than decomposing. The ratio of carbon to sulfur in these sediments reflects how much oxygen was present during burial. By analyzing hundreds of samples from carboniferous rocks worldwide, geochemists built a model of atmospheric oxygen levels through time. The results were striking. At the beginning of the Carboniferous, about 360 million years ago, atmospheric oxygen was probably around 21%, similar to today. But by the middle of the period, around 320 million years ago, oxygen concentration had climbed to 30%. At its peak, roughly 300 million years ago, during the late Carboniferous, oxygen may have reached 35%. Possibly as high as 37% in some models. This is a hyperoxygenated atmosphere. Earth has never experienced oxygen levels that high before or since in the last 500 million years, and it lasted for tens of millions of years, long enough for evolution to explore the possibilities. Why did oxygen rise so dramatically? The answer lies in the forests themselves, and in what didn't happen to those forests when they died. The Carboniferous gets its name from carbon, specifically from the massive coal deposits that formed during this period. When 19th century geologists in England began systematically mapping rock layers, they noticed that rocks of a particular age contained enormous coal seams. These weren't thin layers. These were coal beds tens of meters thick, extending laterally for hundreds of kilometers. The coal of the English Midlands, the coal that powered the Industrial Revolution, came almost entirely from Carboniferous deposits. The same in Pennsylvania, in the Ruhr Valley in Germany, in Silesia in Poland, in Shaanxi province in China. Wherever you find major coal deposits, they're almost always Carboniferous in age. Coal forms from plant material. When plants die and are buried in oxygen-poor conditions, like waterlogged swamps, they don't fully decompose. Instead, they're compressed and heated over geological time, transforming into peat, then lignite, then bituminous coal, and, if conditions are right, anthracite. But this process only works if the plant material doesn't rot. If it decomposes, the carbon is returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. No burial, no coal. In modern ecosystems, dead plant material decomposes efficiently. Fungi and bacteria break it down within years or decades. The carbon cycles back into the atmosphere. The system is balanced. But in the Carboniferous, something was different. Plants were producing enormous amounts of woody tissue using a structural polymer called lignin, which gives wood its rigidity and strength. Lignin had evolved tens of millions of years earlier in the Devonian period, allowing plants to grow tall and form forests. But the organisms capable of efficiently decomposing lignin, certain fungi and bacteria with specialized enzymes, had not yet evolved. This created an imbalance. Plants were pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, fixing it into lignin-rich tissues, and then dying. And when they died, they didn't rot. They just accumulated, layer upon layer of dead wood, piling up in the swamps, slowly being buried under sediment as rivers deposited silt and as sea levels rose and fell. Over millions of years, that accumulated plant material was compressed into the coal we burn today. But here's the other side of the equation. Photosynthesis produces oxygen as a byproduct. Normally, that oxygen is consumed by respiration and decomposition, organisms breathing, organic matter rotting. The system balances. But when organic matter stops decomposing, when it gets buried instead, the oxygen isn't consumed. It accumulates in the atmosphere. So Carboniferous forests were incredibly productive, pulling carbon dioxide out of the air and fixing it into tissues. That carbon was being buried rather than recycled, which meant CO2 levels fell and oxygen levels rose. By the late Carboniferous, atmospheric carbon dioxide had dropped from perhaps 1,500 parts per million in the early Carboniferous to levels approaching modern pre-industrial concentrations, around 300 parts per million. Meanwhile, oxygen climbed to 35% or higher. This atmospheric shift created conditions that allowed insects to achieve sizes impossible under modern chemistry. To understand why, you need to understand how insects breathe. Insects don't have lungs. They have a tracheal system, a network of tubes that opens to the outside through holes called spiracles, usually located along the sides of the body. Air enters through the spiracles and flows through progressively smaller tubes, tracheae, then tracheoles, that branch throughout the body, delivering oxygen directly to tissues. There's no blood involved in oxygen transport, at least not in the way vertebrates use blood. The system is entirely based on diffusion and, in some insects, on active pumping of air sacs. This system is elegant and efficient at small sizes. A fruit fly, with a body a few millimeters long, can oxygenate all its tissues perfectly well through passive diffusion. But diffusion has limits. Oxygen molecules moving through air in a tube will diffuse a certain distance before the concentration gradient becomes too shallow to drive further movement. That distance depends on oxygen concentration. At 21% oxygen, modern levels, the effective diffusion distance is maybe a few millimeters to a centimeter or so. That sets a practical upper limit on insect body size. But increase oxygen concentration to 35%, and you extend the diffusion distance substantially. More oxygen molecules in the air means steeper concentration gradients, which means faster and farther diffusion. Suddenly, an insect can be much larger and still oxygenate its tissues adequately. The tracheal system that would fail at 21% oxygen works fine at 35%. This is why Meganeura could exist. Its tracheal system, its thoracic flight muscles, the massive muscles that power the wings, all of it could function because atmospheric oxygen concentration made long-distance diffusion feasible. A 70-centimeter wingspan translates to a body about 40 centimeters long and perhaps 15 centimeters in diameter at the thorax. That's orders of magnitude larger than modern dragonflies. And it could fly, could hunt, could sustain the energetic demands of powered flight because the atmosphere provided enough oxygen. Researchers have actually tested this. In the early 2000s, a team led by John Vandenbrooks at Arizona State University raised modern dragonflies in hyperoxygenated chambers where oxygen concentration was elevated to 30%. The experiment ran for multiple generations. The result? Dragonflies raised in high oxygen conditions grew measurably larger, about 15% increase in body size compared to control groups raised in normal atmospheric conditions. 15% doesn't sound dramatic, but remember, these were modern dragonflies with genomes and developmental programs optimized for small size through hundreds of millions of years of evolution. They weren't selected for size. The experiment just exposed them to higher oxygen for a few generations. And yet, they grew larger. The effect was real, statistically significant, and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2010. It's direct experimental evidence that atmospheric oxygen concentration controls maximum insect size. So Meganeura could exist because the atmosphere allowed it. But what was it exactly? What did it do? How did it live? Let's reconstruct it. Start with the wings. Fossilized wings are the most commonly preserved part of Meganeura because wings are thin, flat structures that fossilize well when buried in fine-grained sediment. The wings show a dense network of veins, strengthening structures filled with hemolymph and tracheae when the animal was alive. The venation pattern is characteristic of the order Meganisoptera, an extinct group related to modern dragonflies and damselflies, but distinct from both. The forewings and hindwings were roughly equal in size, spanning 35 centimeters each in a typical specimen, giving a total wingspan of 70 centimeters. The wings attached to the pterothorax, the fused middle section of the body, which housed the flight muscles. Insect flight muscles are among the most metabolically active tissues known. They contract hundreds of times per second in some species, consuming oxygen and glucose at prodigious rates. Meganeura's flight muscles must have been enormous relative to its body size, filling much of the thoracic cavity. Dragonfly flight is astonishingly sophisticated. Modern dragonflies can hover, fly backward, execute sharp turns at high speed, and maintain stable flight in turbulent air. They achieve this through independent control of each wing. 4 wings, each with its own set of muscles, each capable of adjusting angle and beat frequency independently. This gives them unmatched aerial agility. Meganeura almost certainly had similar capabilities, scaled up. The head would have been dominated by the eyes. Modern dragonflies have some of the most sophisticated visual systems in the insect world. Each compound eye contains up to 30,000 individual ommatidia, tiny lenses, each providing a pixel of the overall image. The dragonfly brain processes these 30,000 inputs from each eye simultaneously, creating a mosaic image with extraordinary motion sensitivity. Dragonflies can detect movement faster than almost any other animal. Their flicker fusion rate, the speed at which separate images blur into continuous motion, is around 200 Hz, compared to about 60 Hz for humans. To a dragonfly, the world appears to move in slow motion. Meganeura's eyes were probably similar in structure, but larger. A head capsule 15 centimeters wide could accommodate eyes with 50,000 or more ommatidia, providing even higher resolution. And we know from the structure of fossilized heads that the eyes wrapped around the sides, giving nearly 360 degrees of horizontal vision and wide vertical coverage. Prey wouldn't escape by moving into a blind spot, because there were no blind spots. Behind the eyes, mandibles. Dragonfly mandibles are crushing jaws, lined with teeth, capable of shearing through exoskeleton. Meganeura's mandibles would have been proportionally massive, perhaps 5 centimeters long, lined with serrated edges. They could bite through the body of another large insect. They could bite through the skin and muscle of a small vertebrate. Bite marks found on fossilized amphibian bones from Carboniferous deposits have been tentatively attributed to Meganeura, though definitive proof is difficult. The legs, 6, like all insects, were long and spined. Dragonflies use their legs not for walking, but for prey capture and perching. The front legs fold forward, forming a basket that closes around prey in flight. The spines prevent escape. Once prey is secured, the mandibles do the work. Meganeura probably hunted the same way. Spot prey with those enormous eyes. Calculate an intercept course. Accelerate. Modern dragonflies can reach speeds of 50 kilometers per hour. Meganeura might have managed similar or higher speeds. Close the leg basket. Bite. Feed in flight. The whole sequence taking seconds. What did it hunt? Other insects, certainly. The Carboniferous skies were full of flying insects. Early relatives of mayflies, primitive relatives of cockroaches and grasshoppers, other smaller dragonfly species. But we also have evidence, bite marks, gut contents in exceptionally preserved specimens that Meganeura hunted vertebrates. Early amphibians, particularly juveniles or small species, would have been vulnerable. An amphibian basking on a log or rock, warming itself in the sun, unaware of aerial threats, is an easy target. This is the inversion that makes the Carboniferous so alien. In your world, insects are prey. Vertebrates hunt them. In the Carboniferous, insects hunted vertebrates. Meganeura was an apex predator, but it wasn't alone. The Carboniferous had other giants, equally impressive, equally terrifying if you encountered them. Consider Arthropleura. Picture a millipede. Now scale it up until it's 2.5 meters long, 8 feet. Longer than most adult humans are tall, as wide as your torso, with dozens of segments, each bearing 2 pairs of legs, allowing it to ripple across the forest floor with disturbing fluidity. Arthropleura fossils were first discovered in European coal mines in the mid-19th century, around the same time Meganeura was being described. But for decades, paleontologists had only fragments, individual segments, isolated leg pieces, trackways showing where the animal had walked. It wasn't until the 20th century that more complete fossils were found, revealing the true size. The best specimens come from Monceau-les-Mines in France, another coal mining region like Commentry, and from sites in England and Scotland. One specimen from Scotland, found in the 1920s and now housed in the National Museum of Scotland, preserves about half the body and shows details of the segmentation and leg structure. Based on this and other fragments, paleontologists estimate maximum length at around 2.6 meters, possibly as long as 2.8 meters for the largest individuals. Arthropleura was an arthropod, specifically a myriapod, related to modern millipedes and centipedes. Its body was divided into 30 or more segments, each with a dorsal plate, a curved shield of exoskeleton protecting the top, and 2 pairs of legs ventrally. The legs were relatively short and robust, positioned directly under the body, allowing the animal to lift its weight off the ground and walk efficiently. The head is poorly known because heads don't fossilize as well as body segments. But based on relatives and on what fragments exist, Arthropleura probably had relatively small heads with simple eyes and chewing mouthparts. What did it eat? This is debated. Most millipedes are detritivores, feeding on dead plant material and fungi. Arthropleura might have been similar, using its massive size not for predation, but for efficiently processing huge quantities of low-quality food, rotting wood, leaf litter, decaying fern fronds. But there's an alternative hypothesis. Some researchers argue that Arthropleura might have been carnivorous or omnivorous. The reasoning is that detritivory doesn't usually favor gigantism. Large body size is metabolically expensive. You need to eat a lot to maintain it. Detritus is low in nutrients, so detritivores tend to be either small and numerous or efficient processors with specialized gut bacteria. Gigantism in arthropods more commonly evolves in predators. Think of giant centipedes, which are active hunters. If Arthropleura was predatory, it would have been terrifying. A 2.5-meter centipede-like creature moving quickly through the undergrowth, seizing other large arthropods or small vertebrates with powerful mandibles, injecting venom, though there's no direct evidence of venom, and consuming them. The thought is unsettling. The truth is, we don't know for certain. Gut contents haven't been preserved in any Arthropleura specimen. What we do know is that it was enormously successful. Arthropleura fossils span from the late Carboniferous into the early Permian, a temporal range of at least 30 million years. Fossils have been found across Europe and North America, indicating wide geographic distribution. And the trackways, fossilized footprints, are relatively common in Carboniferous rocks, suggesting that Arthropleura was abundant. The trackways also tell us about behavior. Some trackways show regular, evenly spaced footprints, indicating steady walking. Others show irregular spacing or sudden turns, possibly indicating feeding behavior or responses to threats. One famous trackway from New Mexico shows 2 parallel sets of prints running alongside each other for several meters, possibly indicating social behavior. 2 individuals traveling together, or perhaps a mating pursuit. Arthropleura went extinct at the end of the early Permian, around 290 million years ago. As oxygen levels declined and as more advanced predatory vertebrates evolved. Its smaller relatives, modern millipedes, survived and are still abundant today, but none approach even a tenth of Arthropleura's size. And then there's Pulmonoscorpius. The name means breathing scorpion, referring to the fact that it had book lungs, respiratory organs also found in spiders. It was discovered in the late 20th century in Scotland in rocks from the early Carboniferous about 340 million years ago. Pulmonoscorpius kirktonensis is known from several well-preserved specimens found near East Kirkton, Scotland, a site famous for exceptionally preserved Carboniferous fossils. The site was once a volcanic lake surrounded by hot springs, and the chemistry of the water inhibited decay, allowing soft tissues and delicate structures to fossilize. As a result, we have more anatomical detail for Pulmonoscorpius than for most Carboniferous arthropods. It was a scorpion, but it was 70 centimeters long, over 2 feet from the tips of its pedipalps, the clawed arms, to the end of its tail. The body alone was about 30 centimeters, with the tail adding another 40 centimeters. The pedipalps, which scorpions use to grab and hold prey, were heavily built with robust claws. The tail ended in a telson, the stinger, which almost certainly contained venom glands. Modern scorpions deliver venom that targets the nervous system, causing paralysis, pain, or death depending on the species and the dose. Pulmonoscorpius venom was probably similar. What did it hunt? Other large arthropods, mostly. The Carboniferous had a diverse fauna of millipedes, centipedes, primitive insects, and other scorpions. Pulmonoscorpius could overpower prey its own size or larger, using its pedipalps to seize and its stinger to incapacitate. It may also have hunted small vertebrates, early amphibians, early reptiles, though evidence for this is circumstantial. Scorpions are ambush predators. They wait in burrows or under cover, often motionless for hours, until prey comes within range. Then they strike with speed that belies their armored bulk. Pulmonoscorpius probably hunted the same way. Position yourself near a water source or along a game trail where other animals pass frequently. Wait. Detect vibrations through sensory hairs on your legs. When something approaches, lunge. Grab with the pedipalps. Sting. Hold until the prey stops moving. Eat. Scorpions glow under ultraviolet light due to fluorescent compounds in their exoskeletons. If Carboniferous scorpions had the same chemistry, and there's no reason to think they didn't, then Pulmonoscorpius would have glowed faintly under the UV-rich sunlight of the Carboniferous. Insects can see ultraviolet, so this might have been a warning signal. I am venomous. Avoid me. Pulmonoscorpius fossils are rare. Scorpions don't fossilize well because they're heavily sclerotized, hardened, but also relatively small, so they're easily destroyed before fossilization. The East Kirkton site is exceptional in preserving them at all. But the specimens we have show that Pulmonoscorpius existed across at least 10 million years and was part of the normal fauna of early Carboniferous ecosystems. There were other giants, giant relatives of modern harvestmen. Opiliones, the long-legged arachnids often called daddy longlegs, reached sizes approaching 30 centimeters in leg span. Giant spiders, though none as large as the misidentified Megarachne from Argentina, which turned out to be a Eurypterid, a sea scorpion, not a spider, but true spiders with body lengths of several centimeters and leg spans of 15 to 20 centimeters did exist. The Carboniferous forest floor was a dangerous place. Every shadow might hide an ambush predator. Every rustle in the leaf litter might be a giant millipede or a hunting scorpion. The air above was ruled by dragonflies the size of hawks, and all of this under a canopy of trees, unlike anything alive today. The forests themselves were alien. If you could walk through a Carboniferous swamp, setting aside the problem that the atmosphere would kill you, the first thing you'd notice is the scale. Trees rise 30 to 40 meters above you, their trunks straight and relatively unbranched until near the top. Some reach 50 meters. That's comparable to a 15-story building. But these aren't trees in the modern sense. The dominant plants are Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, both members of an ancient group called Lycophytes. Today, Lycophytes are represented by small, inconspicuous plants like club mosses, which carpet forest floors and grow maybe 10 to 20 centimeters tall. In the Carboniferous, they were giants. Lepidodendron is called the scale tree because its bark is covered with diamond-shaped scars arranged in spiraling rows up the trunk. Each scar marks where a leaf was attached. Lepidodendron had long, narrow leaves clustered at the top of the trunk in a palm-like crown. The leaves photosynthesized, died, and fell off, leaving the scars. As the tree grew taller, the trunk accumulated more and more scars in a distinctive pattern that makes Lepidodendron bark instantly recognizable in fossils. The trunks were massive, up to 2 meters in diameter at the base, but mostly hollow. The structural support came from a relatively thin cylinder of wood surrounding a large central pith cavity. This made the trees vulnerable to breaking, but it also made them lightweight, which is important because Lepidodendron had shallow root systems. Instead of deep taproots, they had rhizomorphs, horizontal underground stems covered with small rootlets. The rhizomorphs spread laterally, anchoring the tree in the soft, waterlogged soil of the swamps. But they didn't go deep, which meant tall Lepidodendron trees were vulnerable to wind. When they fell suddenly and completely. Sigillaria was similar, but with a different pattern of leaf scars, vertical rows instead of spirals, giving the trunk a ribbed appearance. Sigillaria grew slightly shorter than Lepidodendron, typically 30 to 35 meters, but with thicker trunks. Both trees reproduced via spores, like modern ferns. At the top of the tree, among the leaves, they produced cones, strobili, filled with spores. When the cones matured, they released millions of spores into the wind. Most were lost, but a few would land in suitable wet soil and germinate, growing into the next generation. And here's something critical. These trees were monocarpic. They grew rapidly, reached reproductive maturity, reproduced once, and died. Like bamboo, but at the scale of a 15-story building. A Lepidodendron might grow from a spore to full adult height in 10 to 15 years, adding several meters per year during peak growth, then produce cones, release spores, and die. The entire life cycle compressed into perhaps 20 years at most. This creates a forest with a very different structure than modern forests. In a modern, temperate forest, trees live for decades to centuries. Oaks can live 500 years. Redwoods can live 2,000 years. The forest is multi-generational, with mature trees, young saplings, and everything in between. Carboniferous forests were more like bamboo forests, cohorts of trees all roughly the same age, growing together, reproducing together, dying together. The forest was a mosaic of patches at different successional stages. Imagine walking through an area where a cohort of lepidodendron had recently died. Fallen trunks lie everywhere, some still relatively intact, others partially collapsed, all slowly being buried in sediment and plant debris. The canopy is open. Sunlight reaches the ground. Ferns and smaller lycophytes carpet the forest floor, competing for space. Insects are abundant. Dragonflies hunting, millipedes processing detritus, primitive relatives of cockroaches scurrying through the leaf litter. Now walk a few hundred meters to an area where the trees are reaching maturity. The canopy closes overhead, blocking most sunlight. The understory is dim, humid, relatively open, because few plants can grow in such low light. The trunks rise like columns, their scale-patterned bark disappearing into the shadows above. Somewhere up there, 30 meters above the ground, is the canopy where the leaves are, where photosynthesis happens, where spore cones are developing. The sound is omnipresent, the hum of insect wings. It's not loud exactly, but it's constant, a baseline drone that never stops. Millions of insects, all flying, all vibrating the air with their wing beats. It's the sound of a world where insects are the dominant flying organisms, where the sky belongs to them. And notice what's missing. There are no bird calls because there are no birds. There are no mammal sounds, no rustling in the undergrowth, no howls or chirps, because mammals don't exist yet. The largest vertebrates are amphibians and early reptiles, none longer than a few meters, most smaller. They're present but not abundant. They move quietly, warily, aware that the dominant predators are not other vertebrates, but giant arthropods. There are no flowers. Flowering plants won't evolve for another 150 million years. Everything reproduces via spores, or, in the case of early seed plants that were beginning to appear in the late Carboniferous, via primitive seeds. But there's no color, no floral displays, no fruits. The palette of the forest is greens and browns, living foliage and dead wood. That's all. The air smells of decay, wet wood, rotting vegetation, stagnant water, fungal growth. It's the smell of an ecosystem where organic matter is accumulating faster than it can decompose. The swamps are choked with dead plant material. Logs pile up. Leaves accumulate into thick mats of detritus. All of it slowly sinking into the water, slowly being buried, slowly transforming into peat, and eventually into coal. Which brings us to the question, why didn't it rot? In a modern forest, when a tree dies and falls, decomposition begins immediately. Fungi colonize the wood, breaking down cellulose and lignin. Bacteria follow. Insects, termites, wood-boring beetles tunnel through, fragmenting the wood and inoculating it with microorganisms. Within a decade in a temperate forest, or within a few years in a tropical forest, the tree is gone. The carbon has been returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. The nutrients have been recycled into the soil. In the Carboniferous, that didn't happen. Trees died, fell into the swamps, and just sat there. Partially because the waterlogged, low oxygen conditions of the swamps inhibited decay. Decomposition requires oxygen. In water-saturated soil, oxygen concentrations are low, which slows microbial activity. But that's only part of the answer, because even in low oxygen conditions, some decomposition should occur over timescales of decades to centuries. Carboniferous wood persisted for millions of years. The real answer is lignin. Lignin is a complex organic polymer that gives wood its rigidity. It's composed of cross-linked phenolic compounds arranged in a three-dimensional network. It's chemically stable, resistant to most forms of biological attack. Breaking it down requires specialized enzymes that can cleave specific bonds in the polymer. These enzymes, lignin peroxidases and licases, are produced by certain fungi, particularly white rot fungi in the phylum Basidiomycota. But white rot fungi didn't exist in the early and middle Carboniferous. Lignin had evolved in plants back in the Devonian period, around 400 million years ago, allowing plants to grow tall and form the first forests. But for the next 50 to 100 million years, nothing could efficiently decompose it. There was an evolutionary lag. Plants could produce a compound that no organisms could break down. And during that lag, dead plant material accumulated. The evidence for this comes from multiple sources. First, coal itself. The sheer volume of Carboniferous coal deposits implies that organic material was buried at rates far exceeding modern rates. Modern peat formation occurs, but it's relatively slow and localized. Carboniferous coal beds extend across continents and represent tens of millions of years of continuous accumulation. That level of burial requires that decomposition was suppressed. Second, molecular clock studies. Geneticists can estimate when lineages diverged by analyzing the rate of mutations in DNA. Molecular clock analyses of fungi suggest that white rot fungi, the lineage capable of efficiently degrading lignin, evolved in the late Carboniferous or early Permian, around 300 to 290 million years ago. Before that, the enzymes didn't exist. Third, the geochemical evidence. Carboniferous rocks have carbon isotope ratios consistent with massive burial of organic carbon. When carbon is buried rather than respired, it fractionates isotopes in a characteristic way. The ratios in Carboniferous sediments match what you'd expect if decomposition was incomplete. So, here's what happened. Forests grew. Trees died. They fell into swamps. They didn't rot. They piled up. Sediment, silt, and clay carried by rivers buried them. More trees grew on top. They died. They piled up. This continued for tens of millions of years. The accumulation was immense. In some areas, the thickness of accumulated organic material, now coal, exceeds 50 meters. That represents millions of trees, millions of tons of carbon, all locked away. And because that carbon wasn't being returned to the atmosphere, atmospheric CO2 levels fell. Photosynthesis was pulling CO2 out of the air and fixing it into plant tissues. Normally, respiration and decomposition return it. But if decomposition isn't happening, the carbon stays locked up, CO2 falls, and oxygen rises. Photosynthesis produces oxygen as a byproduct. Normally, that oxygen is consumed by aerobic respiration, organisms breathing, and by the oxidation of organic matter during decay. But if organic matter isn't decaying, less oxygen is consumed. It accumulates in the atmosphere. So Carboniferous forests were creating the conditions that allowed giant insects to exist. High oxygen concentration supporting large body sizes. And those forests were creating coal, which 300 million years later would power human civilization. You are living on energy stored during the Carboniferous. When you turn on a light powered by a coal plant, you're burning a tree that grew when Meganeura ruled the skies. But there was another consequence of high oxygen: fire. Oxygen is what allows combustion to occur. Fire is a chemical reaction between fuel and oxygen, releasing energy as heat and light. The rate and intensity of combustion depend on oxygen concentration. Increase oxygen and things burn more easily, burn hotter, burn faster. At 35% oxygen, the flammability of plant material increases dramatically. In your world, with 21% oxygen, wet vegetation doesn't burn well. Rainforests don't experience wildfires under normal conditions because the fuel is too moist. You need dry conditions, drought, low humidity, for fire to spread. Not in the Carboniferous. At 35% oxygen, even damp plant material can ignite and sustain combustion. A lightning strike in a Carboniferous swamp could start a fire that would burn through vegetation that would never burn in modern conditions. And we have direct evidence that this happened constantly. The evidence is fusion, fossilized charcoal. When plant material burns incompletely, it produces charcoal, which is almost pure carbon with a distinctive cellular structure preserved from the original plant. Charcoal is extremely resistant to further decay, so it preserves well in the fossil record. Paleobotanists call fossilized charcoal fusane, and it's one of the most common plant fossil types in Carboniferous rocks. In some Carboniferous coal seams, fusane makes up 10 to 20% of the total plant material. That's an extraordinary proportion. It means that a significant fraction of the vegetation was burning before it could be buried and converted to coal. And if that much charcoal made it into the geological record, surviving burial, compaction, and coalification, the actual amount of fire on the landscape must have been even higher, because most charcoal would have been consumed or oxidized before fossilization. Studies of fusane abundance through time show a clear correlation with atmospheric oxygen concentration. During the Carboniferous and early Permian, when oxygen was at its peak, fusine is abundant. During later periods when oxygen was lower, fusine is rarer. The correlation is strong enough that paleobotanists use fusane abundance as a proxy for oxygen concentration in intervals where direct geochemical measurements aren't available. So the Carboniferous landscape was burning. Frequently, perhaps not constantly in any given area, but somewhere, at any time, fires were burning. The swamps would ignite from lightning strikes. The fires would spread through the understory, consuming ferns and the lower portions of lycophyte trunks. The heat would create convective columns, updrafts of hot air rising rapidly, creating their own localized weather. Smoke would darken the sky, ash would rain down, and then, eventually, the fire would burn itself out or be extinguished by rain. Animals would flee. Arthropleura, for all its size, could move quickly when necessary, undulating away from the flames. Meganeura and other flying insects would take to the air, escaping upward and laterally. Amphibians would dive into water. Smaller arthropods would burrow into soil or hide under logs. Some wouldn't escape. Fossilized charred insect remains have been found in Carboniferous deposits, evidence of individuals caught by the flames. And then the forest would regrow. Ferns are often the first plants to recolonize after fire, growing rapidly from spores or from underground rhizomes that survived the heat. Within a few years, a burned area would be carpeted with ferns. Within a decade, young lycophytes would be growing, beginning the next cycle. The forest was dynamic, constantly shifting between burned and unburned patches, between young regrowth and mature stands. Fire was an ecological force in the Carboniferous on a scale that has never been repeated. High oxygen made combustion easy. The accumulation of dead plant material, remember, it wasn't rotting, provided abundant fuel. Lightning provided ignition. The result was a world where fire was as much a part of the ecosystem as predation or photosynthesis. Some Carboniferous plants show adaptations consistent with fire tolerance. Certain lycophytes had thick bark that could insulate the living tissues beneath from heat. Some ferns had deep rhizomes that could survive surface fires and re-sprout afterward. These adaptations, which we see in modern fire-adapted ecosystems like savannas and chaparral, appear in Carboniferous plants 100 million years before similar ecosystems evolved later in Earth. History. The plants were adapting to a world that burned regularly. And yet, despite the fires, despite the high oxygen, despite the giant predatory arthropods, the Carboniferous persisted for 60 million years. That's longer than the entire Cenozoic era, the age of mammals. It's longer than the time from the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs to today. The Carboniferous was stable in its way. The forests grew. The insects thrived. The coal accumulated. For tens of millions of years, this was the normal state of the world. But nothing lasts forever. Conditions change, and when they changed, the giants died. The end of the Carboniferous came gradually. There was no asteroid, no volcanic catastrophe, no single event that killed the giant insects. Instead, atmospheric chemistry shifted over millions of years, and the organisms adapted to the old chemistry couldn't survive the new. The shift began when fungi evolved the ability to decompose lignin. Somewhere in the late Carboniferous or early Permian, a lineage of fungi acquired the genes for producing lignin peroxidase, an enzyme that can break the bonds in lignin polymers. This might have happened through mutation, through horizontal gene transfer from bacteria, or through some combination. However it happened, it was a breakthrough. Suddenly, dead wood was no longer indigestible. It could be broken down, metabolized, returned to the carbon cycle. The effects cascaded. Fungi with this capability spread rapidly because they had access to an enormous, previously untapped food source. All the dead wood littering the Carboniferous swamps. Dead trees that would have sat intact for centuries now decomposed within decades. The carbon locked in lignin was released as carbon dioxide. The carbon burial rate crashed. This broke the feedback loop that had elevated oxygen. Without massive carbon burial, atmospheric CO2 stopped falling and began to rise again as respiration and decomposition returned carbon to the atmosphere. And without excess oxygen production, because photosynthesis was now balanced by respiration, atmospheric oxygen stopped rising and began to fall. Slowly, over millions of years, oxygen concentration declined from its Carboniferous peak of 35% toward lower values. By the Middle Permian, around 280 million years ago, oxygen had fallen to perhaps 30%. By the late Permian, around 260 million years ago, it was maybe 25%. By the end of the Permian and into the Triassic, it approached modern levels, 21% or slightly higher. The hyperoxygenated atmosphere of the Carboniferous was over, and as oxygen fell, the giants died. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but progressively as each generation faced slightly less favorable conditions than the last. A Meganeura with a 70-centimeter wingspan requires a certain minimum oxygen concentration to oxygenate its flight muscles. At 35% oxygen, no problem. At 30%, it's manageable, but more difficult. At 25%, it's borderline. At 21%, it's impossible. The diffusion gradients aren't steep enough. The oxygen can't reach the deep tissues quickly enough. The flight muscles become hypoxic, oxygen-starved. Flight becomes unsustainable. So, over millions of years, as oxygen fell, maximum viable insect size fell with it. Lineages that had thrived as giants either adapted by evolving smaller body sizes, or they went extinct. Some dragonfly lineages made the transition. Modern dragonflies are descended from Carboniferous giants, but they're a fraction of the size because their ancestors adapted to declining oxygen by becoming smaller. Other lineages, like Meganeuridae, the family containing Meganeura, didn't adapt. They went extinct. The last Meganeurids disappear from the fossil record in the early Permian, around 290 million years ago. Arthropleura lasted slightly longer. Fossils are found up to about 290 million years ago in the early Permian. Then they vanish. The giant millipedes couldn't survive in the new low-oxygen world. Their smaller relatives, modern millipedes, persisted because they could still oxygenate their tissues at smaller sizes. But the giants were gone. Pulmonoscorpius had already disappeared earlier in the Middle Carboniferous, possibly due to competition from other predators or changing environmental conditions. But giant scorpions in general declined through the Permian as oxygen fell. By the end of the Permian, the age of giant insects was over. It had lasted roughly 60 to 70 million years, depending on how you define giant and which lineages you count. That's a long time. Longer than the age of dinosaurs. Longer than the age of mammals. But it was temporary. It depended on atmospheric conditions that were themselves temporary. The survivors were the small insects, the ones that didn't depend on high oxygen concentration, the ones that could function efficiently at modest sizes. And those small insects went on to become the most diverse group of animals on Earth. Today, there are more than 1 million described species of insects. Estimates of total diversity, including undescribed species, range from 5 million to 10 million species, possibly higher. Insects occupy every terrestrial habitat and many aquatic ones. They pollinate most flowering plants, a critical ecological service that appeared in the Cretaceous when flowers evolved. They decompose organic matter, recycling nutrients. They're food for countless other organisms. They're vectors for diseases. They're pests of agriculture. They're partners in symbiotic relationships. They've colonized every continent, including Antarctica. Their success is due to adaptability. Small size allows rapid reproduction and quick adaptation to changing conditions. Short generation times mean evolution operates quickly. A population can adapt to new pressures within years or decades. Diverse feeding strategies mean that when one food source disappears, other insects can exploit remaining sources. The insects that survived the end of the Carboniferous were the ones that could tolerate change. And that capacity for tolerating change has made them the most resilient major animal group in the fossil record. Insects have survived every mass extinction event in the last 400 million years. The late Devonian extinctions, which killed many marine organisms, insects survived. The end Permian extinction, the worst in Earth history, which killed 96% of marine species, insects took losses but persisted. The end Triassic extinction survived. The end Cretaceous impact that killed the dinosaurs survived with minimal losses. They are virtually extinction-proof as a class. Compare that to the Carboniferous giants, Meganeura, Arthropleura, Pulmonoscorpius, all extinct. They were spectacular, successful for tens of millions of years, dominant in their ecosystems. But when conditions changed, they disappeared. They were too specialized, too dependent on specific atmospheric chemistry. There's a lesson in that. Specialization creates vulnerability. The more finely tuned you are to one set of conditions, the more you struggle when those conditions change. And conditions always change, given enough time. We, humans, collectively, are specialized, not biologically, particularly. Humans as a species are reasonably adaptable omnivores capable of living in diverse climates. But our civilization is specialized. We've built everything: agriculture, cities, infrastructure, economies. on the assumption that climate will remain roughly as it has been for the last 10,000 years. Stable temperatures, predictable rainfall, stable sea levels. That stability enabled agriculture, which enabled cities, which enabled everything we call civilization. And we're ending that stability by burning carboniferous coal, by releasing carbon that was locked away for 300 million years. We're changing atmospheric chemistry. CO2 has risen from about 280 parts per million before industrialization to over 420 parts per million today. That's a 50% increase. The planet has warmed by approximately 1.2 degrees Celsius. We're on track for 2 to 3 degrees of warming by the end of this century, unless emissions are dramatically reduced. Insects will probably be fine. They've survived worse atmospheric shifts. They'll adapt because they're diverse, and because some lineages will tolerate the new conditions. Human civilization is less certain. We depend on stability. Our agriculture is calibrated to specific temperature and rainfall patterns. Our coastal cities assume stable sea levels. Our water resources depend on snowpack and glaciers that are disappearing. We've optimized for current conditions, and those conditions are changing faster than at any time in the last 60 million years. The Carboniferous teaches us that atmospheric chemistry determines which organisms succeed. That changing chemistry reshapes ecosystems fundamentally. That the dominant organisms of one era can be absent in the next when conditions shift. Meganeura ruled the Carboniferous sky. When oxygen fell, it went extinct. Its small descendants survived by being adaptable. We're conducting an experiment on ourselves. We're changing the atmosphere and waiting to see whether we're adaptable enough to survive the changes we're causing. The Carboniferous can't tell us the answer, but it can show us the stakes. It can show us that dominance is no guarantee of survival when conditions change. The atoms that made up Meganeura's body are still here. They've cycled through soil, through other organisms, through the atmosphere, possibly through you. The carbon it breathed is in the air you're breathing. The oxygen it produced during photosynthesis has been cycled billions of times through respiration and photosynthesis. Nothing is lost. Everything transforms. You're part of that cycle. Part of a 4 billion year story of life, adapting to changing conditions, exploiting opportunities, surviving catastrophes, diversifying into new forms. The Carboniferous is one chapter. You're living in another. And the choices you make are writing the next chapter. The Carboniferous lasted 60 million years. The giant insects dominated for 40 million of those years. That's extraordinary success by any measure. But it ended when conditions changed. The giants couldn't adapt. The small insects could. And the small insects inherited the earth. That's the pattern the Carboniferous teaches. Not permanence, adaptation, not dominance, resilience, not size, diversity. The survivors aren't the most impressive, they're the most flexible. Meganeura is extinct. Dragonflies remain. Smaller, less dramatic, but vastly more successful in the long run. They adapted, they survived, they diversified, and they'll almost certainly outlast us. That's not pessimism, it's just observation. Insects have been around for 400 million years. They've survived conditions we can't imagine. They'll survive whatever comes next. Whether we do is an open question. But we have one advantage. We can see the trajectory. We can model future conditions. We can understand the consequences of our actions. We can choose to change course. The Carboniferous giants couldn't. They just lived until the atmosphere changed, and they couldn't anymore. We can choose. That's what intelligence means. The capacity to foresee consequences and modify behavior accordingly. Whether we'll use that capacity is the defining question of this century. The Carboniferous ended 300 million years ago. The giant insects are gone, but their story continues in the coal we burn, in the atmosphere we're changing, in the insects that persist, and in you, if you choose to learn from it. Thank you for staying through this journey into deep time. If this changed how you see the world, if it gave you perspective on your place in the vast continuity of life, please subscribe. Share this with someone who might need that perspective. Leave a comment about what struck you most deeply. These stories from deep time matter because they show us patterns, teach us what works over the long run, and remind us that we're not separate from nature. We're part of it. The Carboniferous is over. The giants are gone. But their legacy persists. In the coal that powers cities, in the atmosphere that's changing, in the insects that adapted, and in the lesson that adaptation outlasts dominance, that flexibility outlasts specialization, and that the survivors are the ones who can change when the world changes. The Carboniferous giants couldn't choose their fate. You can choose yours. Choose wisely.